evening and welcome everyone to Preventing Family Violence, a Community Conversation. I'm your host for the evening, Donna Wheatley. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the Miriam Rose Foundation for that beautiful film, Didiri, that was playing as we all entered. Before we begin, some brief housekeeping. So please check that your phone is off or on silent. I certainly don't like to be that person. I'd like to acknowledge that tonight's presentation and panellists are being filmed, and a captioned recording of this evening will be made available at a future date. Please be assured that due to the sensitivity of tonight's topic, audience members will not be filmed. And I do want to provide a content warning because the conversation will include focus on family and gender violence and may include discussion of sexual assault. And at times this may be a confronting discussion and it will likely bring up some big feelings in all of us. So if at any time you need to step out of the room, please do not hesitate to take some time out. We have a quiet room available off the foyer and we encourage you to make use of that space if you need it. We're also really fortunate to have some expert support workers from the Centre Against Violence and Gateway Health. So we have Jess, Nikita, Erin and Jason, and they're going to be positioned around the exits. So if you need to leave and you don't want to have a chat, give them a thumbs up as you pass them. If you do want to have a chat, they'll be available there with training and resources. So they'll be sitting at both exit points tonight. They're available for support and the support staff will exit the stage and take their places by the exit. So as you're leaving the auditorium, you'd see one of these good people. Thank you guys. I'd now like to hand over. I love that deliberateness about creating that psychological safety. What we're digging into tonight can be very raw. I would like to hand over now to a proud Bunurong woman, Giara Atkinson, who will be welcoming us all to country. Please give her a round of applause.
Thanks everyone. Oh, that was a bit loud. Good evening. As you all just heard, my name is Giara and I'm a proud Bunurong woman from the Moirithaban clan. I would like to start off by welcoming you all here on Bunurong country today. If this falls down to the front row, I'm sorry guys, I'll apologise now. I'd like to pay my respects to my elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to extend my respects to our allies in our community today. We the Bunurong, the people of the tall trees, have been the custodians of this land since time began. Our country encompasses from the northeast of Victoria and southern Riverina Murray region of New South Wales, from the Campaspe River in the west to the Ovens River in the east. Yakamadora Bunurong Waka. Welcome to Bunurong country. Tonight we acknowledge the strength and resilience of victim survivors who have experienced or currently live with family violence, including those who may be here tonight. I'm about to speak about my feelings about my lived experience. I won't go into too many details, but if you think this might be upsetting to you, please feel free to step out for a few minutes. I am a survivor of domestic violence. I have never thought of myself as a victim because I hate the feeling of self-pity. And when I finally found the courage to leave, I hated the expressions on people's faces around me. I hated seeing sympathy in their eyes. I hated when they told me how sorry they were for me. I hated when they would tell me they couldn't believe what I had been through and couldn't imagine it happening to them, because neither could I. I find it hard to stand up here and share a bit about my story with you all, as I haven't shared it with many people, mostly because I still can't believe how much I hated myself in the end. I hated how broken I was, and for a couple of years I couldn't even think about picking up the broken pieces and putting myself together again. I'm standing here today taped together with duct tape, and not a perfect job, but somehow more beautiful than the piece I was before. I struggled not to get emotional when I wrote this speech. I found myself breathing in and inhaling the strength from other women and men who, like me, have survived. I'm honoured to be here today and grateful to be able to say that I made it out, as my heart breaks for those who don't. I would be lying if I told you I'm not still healing from the heartbreak and trauma, but I hope to one day be able to exchange my strength and resilience with the pain of someone who may be where I was and wanting to survive. I want to extend my support and respect to those that have organised this event and also to those working in family violence. You are the silent heroes helping those who are suffering. I think about all the people that gave me words of wisdom and strength along the way, and for that I can only say thank you.
Thank you so much for such a warm welcome. And people of the tall trees, what a beautiful visual that is, and trees are so sacred and important. And I would have to say, Jai, that I think that the pieces put together with duct tape has turned out quite beautiful. Now, my name's Donna Wheatley, as I mentioned. I have a background as a family violence worker when I first started out in my profession. So in the year 2000, I started at Mitchell and Murrumbidgee Shire. So I have postgraduate qualifications around family violence and sexual assault and worked in that industry for a number of years and then moved into private practice. And then I had this great idea that I wanted to spend some time on fire trucks. So I became a professional firefighter. And a lot of people talked about how that would be a real change. But in fact, what I knew about systems and what I knew about caring for people put me in really good stead for being of service in the community as a firefighter. And it's certainly given me two lenses that I come to these conversations with about really understanding the complexities and challenges of being in that operational space, but also the complexity and challenges of systemic gendered disadvantage and the intersectionality of other disadvantage that goes into the experience of family violence that we have in our community. I sort of like to give a little bit of why somebody would allow me to host or facilitate such a wonderful conversation. I'm certainly looking forward to learning a lot from the women that we have who are going to share their views on this one topic, but with their own expertise on each facet that they bring to the conversation. So first up, we're going to be introducing Dr Debra Parkinson. She has decades, her research over decades has covered a range of issues related to women's health, including women leaving violent situations, partner rape, women's access to sexual assault services and to the legal system. And since 2009, which is when I met Deb, her research has focused on gender and disaster, including increases in family violence following the Black Saturday bushfires. And as a firefighter responding to those bushfires and a person who lost colleagues, friends and family in those fires, I was very interested in the research that she and Claire Zara undertook. It was very innovative at the time, and to have watched that unfold and launch the 10-year research into it up here at Wangaratta in 2019, to see now the traction that they are getting. And I don't know if you caught the drum, but her research was referred to a couple of times by Julia Baird this week. So this is the topic of conversation. I think that we're very lucky to have somebody who's so expert around the research of this area to present to us tonight. So if you can help me welcome Dr Debra Parkinson.
That was such a wonderful introduction. I don't know that I can live up to that. It was great to see familiar faces too, and I'll see you after. I'd like to start though by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, the Bangarang people, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and of course thank Giara. On Monday, 9th of February 2009, here in Wangaratta, Susie Reid gathered our small team in the front room at Women's Health, Goulburn North East. We were in a state of disbelief. An hour down the Hume Freeway, 2 days earlier, The Black Saturday bushfires had killed 173 people. My colleagues Claire Zara, Rachel McKay, Julie Tyler and others made calls to offer help. The answer was consistent. Recovery organisations were overwhelmed with volunteers. We needed to wait. Instead, we began to research. The literature review found that violence against women increases in disasters in other countries. Does it happen here in Australia too? With ethics approval, around August of that year, Claire and I began 109 in-depth interviews with 47 disaster workers, 30 women and 32 men. We did more research later, notably with 57 people in 2018 on long-term disaster resilience, and in 2020 about what happens to primary prevention in epidemics. Every one of our research participants took a risk. In rural communities, as you know, researchers can't guarantee confidentiality and fear of retribution is real. In 2009, there was no published research in Australia. After a decade, we now have evidence that domestic violence increases, and we know why it happens. Don't worry, I don't expect you to read this. A disaster is defined by losses exceeding the capacity of a community to cope. COVID is one kind of disaster and bushfires another. Domestic violence, which I'll call DV from now on, increases in both. How do the social impacts of these two kinds of disasters compare? This Venn diagram shows that the gendered impacts on men, women and LGBTIQA+ people are the same in almost every aspect. It's that middle column. That happens both in the response phase and also in the aftermath. There's increased violence against women, more rigid traditional gender stereotyping and expectations, restriction of movement, men in authority, drug and alcohol abuse, decreased police reporting, decreased access to support, incursions into women's rights and more. A difference is that male heroism does not apply in COVID. There's a greater willingness to address the increase in DV because we're not talking about firefighters and pillars of the community. Try a Google search of DV and COVID compared to DV and bushfires. This gives a clue as to causation. In countries as diverse as Iran, Pakistan, Japan and Australia, domestic violence increases in disasters. There are commonalities right across the world of women's sacrifice, victim blaming and excusing men's violence. In disasters, there's a litany of triggers, though not causes, of DV. Unsafe or insecure housing, food insecurity, substance abuse, stress, trauma, grief and loss, relationship problems, economic pressures, unemployment, complex bureaucratic processes regarding support, grants and insurance, restricted movement and transport, a changed community and changed life courses. Less identified as an explanation for DV in disasters is the role of patriarchy and male privilege in allowing violence against women and children. Disasters present a window of opportunity for change and historically hard-won progress for marginalised groups is clawed back in those times. Consider discrimination against women in the COVID response regarding JobKeeper and the stimulus to male sectors of construction and energy. The gender schema is reinforced very effectively in times of disaster by representations that fit the gender stereotypes. Men as protector and provider, both as uniformed authorities and as heads of households. and women as nurturer, putting themselves last for the good of the family. Cultural acceptance of women's sacrifice condemns women. A Bangladesh study found 86% of mothers had been abused by their husbands during a flood. In 2020, Pakistani researcher Falakshad Maman wrote, "What came out as astonishing was a majority of women's acceptance of this violence." One respondent said, "I have nowhere to go. Besides, if he will not take his frustrations out on me, then on whom? I am his wife, I have to bear it." After Black Saturday, women's sacrifice was also accepted. A worker told us of her observations in recovery work. Not saying anything about DV is not the right thing to do, but maybe people understood why it was happening, and maybe that's why they didn't do anything. One woman told us, "After the fires, he was just taking it out on the person that he could, and I was the strong one, and I kept thinking, better me than the kids." In our first research report after Black Saturday, we wrote, "This country accepts that violence against women increased after earthquakes in Haiti and cyclones in Bangladesh, but nobody wants to hear that men who embody the spirit of resilient and heroic Australia are violent towards their families." Women spoke of seeking help with no positive outcome. With family, they were ignored, accused of overreacting, and blamed for not caring well enough for their men. Police were not following their own code of conduct. One worker said, "So much has been justified as a result of the fires, so much fobbed off. So many women have gone to police and been told by police things will settle down again." Police, case managers, community members, trauma psychologists, and even family violence professionals empathised with traumatised and suffering men and encouraged women to wait it out. This confirmed to women that they were unimportant after this disaster. Ultimately, some gave up. One woman, after finishing our interview, said, "I'll get out of here in a box," revealing her level of powerlessness and surrender. The urgency of disaster response, the valorisation of male heroism, and the complexity of post-disaster trauma compromises safety. The Disaster is No Excuse for Family Violence postcard challenges this silencing. With help from Kerry Burns, we adapted our Partner Rape postcard, continuously in print since 2012, with thousands distributed and now in 10 languages. The Red Cross has requested permission to get them into flood-affected Queensland and New South Wales right now. The postcard gives 4 simple steps so community members and recovery workers know the words to say to women, and gives crisis line numbers. So what's happening for men? Men took up hypermasculine behaviours in the fire's aftermath to regain a sense of themselves as men. Sometimes this was through overwork, dawn till dusk, sometimes through speeding in cars and motorbikes down dangerous mountain roads, sometimes through drinking with other men in pubs, on the street or in the home, and sometimes through violence towards their families. In our research, men who were career firefighters told how loss of control in the catastrophic fires led to shame and remorse in the aftermath. If they felt they'd failed as protector, they'd failed as a man. As one woman in our research said of her husband, they were the professional firefighters. It was their job to stop the unstoppable. They bear the grief and the loss and the guilt. And men were expected to be heroic. Women spoke of anger at their partner's failure to live up to this male standard and questioned their courage. One said to Dr. Rob Gordon, "I wanted a man who would protect me or die in the attempt." Such unrealistic expectations continued in the aftermath. One man explained, "Expectations, okay, to get things back to normal, to make things better, to rebuild, and I think to appear effective. And Christ, the men really needed to appear as if they were effective, productive, constructive members of the community." Men's reluctance to talk about trauma and the stigma associated with counselling were strong themes. This is known as double jeopardy. The masculine ideal is impossible to meet, but help cannot be sought because real men don't admit any weakness. There are good reasons for their reluctance. Our society monitors enactment of gender roles, and there are career penalties and loss of statement for men who show emotion other than anger. One man said when he cried at work after the fires, his colleague said, "I thought you were more of a man than that." Researchers have drawn a direct link between men's perceived failure to live up to their own and society's expectations and domestic violence. Many of you know of the Claire Zara Memorial Oration held in the Emergency Management Conference in Melbourne. The first oration in 2015 was given by the then Sex Discrimination Commissioner Liz Broderick and Head of Army Angus Houston. Claire's influence lives on each year through powerful orations from significant Australians. This year, we've circled back to invite the current Sex Discrimination Commissioner, Kate Jenkins, as the 8th Claire Zara Memorial Orator. It feels right that Wang is the place we first publicly announced that Gender and Disaster Australia will soon be an independent organisation. Federal funding was announced 3 months ago to extend our training nationally, led by Rach McKay and the GAD Oz team. We're being heard, and this is only possible because of the women and men who took a risk and spoke of their experience. I'll conclude with 6 ways to bring our gender schema into this century and prevent domestic violence. 1, don't let the tyranny of the urgent be an excuse to give rights up for women. Don't expect men to be heroes, and stop expecting women to sacrifice their health and well-being. Identify these as outdated notions that put people's lives at risk. 3, disentangle masculinity from firefighting. Failure to raise female participation is the result of bastions of male power preventing it. 4, let men be vulnerable. 5, use our postcard so that we can hear women speak of violence. And 6, ensure women and children's right to live free from violence is unconditional, even in disasters. Thank you.
Now, I understand that we have a few moments for Deb to take some questions from the audience. I think we have Amy and somebody else with a roving mic. So if you have a question, a hand up, and those 2 wonderful people will find you. I can see a hand here. Here comes, I'm sure that's Amy. It's a bit hard with the spotlights.
Thank you, Deborah. I'm just interested, how can we expect first responders to consider gender when they're fighting a fire? It's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, we often get that question. The thing is, we don't have any expectation that we would have a gender expert in the incident control room, and we don't expect the people in there to be thinking about gender at the height of a bushfire or the height of a flood or whatever it is. But the trick is that it has to be incorporated into every stage of planning, and probably not so much in the response, but if we've done the planning right, the response is going to be right, the reconstruction afterwards will follow. So we have a set of what we call GEM guidelines, Gender and Emergency Management Guidelines, which were informed by 500 emergency management personnel. And they just set out things like, look around in your community. Is that disaster planning group representative of your community? Do you have women, LGBTI people? cold people, First Nations people? Do you have people with school kids, older people? So you make sure that the whole community is represented and you understand the dangers that people are in a disaster.
Hi, the decrease in reporting to police, is that associated with the excuse of behaviours, or is it something else that you've discovered?
Yeah, the decrease in reporting was often that the police would turn up after being called, but they would decide not to record that. And that was out of respect for the man. This is a term that I'm using as a quote. People really erroneously thought that it was more respectful to not use the words family violence or domestic violence and to say he's upset, he's traumatised, he was on the back of the truck, you know, you've got to give him some time, you've got to support him better. So they just weren't dealing with it. And I've been saying this since 2012, the police have never asked me to stop, and they've been in the audience lots of times. They knew they were doing it. The decreased reporting too, there's so much pressure on women to not talk about what's happening. You know, that huge list I read out of the pressures on people. And women said, other people have got bigger problems than me. You know, I can deal with this. Some people took 10 years to get out of that relationship. We found that in our long-term disaster resilience. One woman said, one day she was shooting baskets, playing basketball with her two teenage boys, and one of them said to her, "Mum, I know things are really hard for you, but please don't leave, it's too hard for us." So those kind of pressures.
Any other hands pop up there, did they? Just means I get to talk more. It's a community conversation, feel free. Okay, beautiful. Well, let's put our hands together for Dr. Debra Parkinson. I like that question about how can we expect firefighters to be thinking about gender while they're responding. Now, I've done 20 years of responding in a paid fire service, and there's a whole heap of things that are in my background that mean that I understand and I see a situation differently to the average firefighter. So I think it needs to be, you know, we need to have an understanding of the context of what community we're serving, and this is a big part of what's going on in the community, and it can definitely be something that informs, you know, subtly those asking the questions, hearing, watching for particular things, and the training that Gender and Disaster do for responders and people into the recovery phase helps them have that as that background context. I worked, and I must say, I'm here as Donna in my personal capacity. I'm not here in my work capacity. It just gives me a whole heap of experience and expertise to put around my conversation. But I pushed for 2 years for just our peers to have some introductory family violence training at the service that I worked at, and Ada Conroy came from Women's Health, and I remember the resistance. It's different for us. You know, we're in uniform. There's all this privilege. There's all this assumption about, you know, we serve, we look after. And it's not different. You know, I've been in mess rooms and watched, and I've spoken to people who have shared, and it affects every part of our society. And I remember Ada saying, "Oh, this is not my opinion, this is the evidence." And Deborah and Claire's work has given us more evidence on a local basis about the importance of us understanding this and embedding it in our response and recovery systems. I told you I'd talk more if you didn't have another question. So now, sorry, I've got to get back because it's just me freewheeling. I now have to introduce our next speaker, who is Jamie Chubb, who I had a great conversation with the other day. She's the CEO of the Centre Against Violence. Now, with a career spanning youth services, community health and local government, Jamie leads the Centre Against Violence team throughout the Ovens and Murray region to prevent, respond to and support the recovery from family violence and sexual assault. And I think that our panellists will be joining as Jamie comes onto the stage as well. So we're just going to put some people in their positions as we welcome Jamie to the stage.
Thank you. So while the panel gets seated, I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet tonight, the Bangarang people, and pay our respects to the elders past, present and future, for they hold the memories, the tradition and the culture of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So, as per the introduction, I'm the CEO of the Centre Against Violence, and I've had the privilege of holding this role since late last year. Prior to that, I actually worked for the Rural City of Wangaratta and was there for a number of years, of which we experienced some significant impacts for our community, including bushfires. So just over 2 years ago, we opened the doors to this very performing arts centre and operated as a regional relief centre for a period that spanned over 2 weeks. So whilst the bushfires of 2020 raged around us, thousands of people from throughout the region were forced to evacuate, many of them several times over the period of time. On some days you could barely see because of the smoke. All of our phones were constantly pinging with warnings and evacuation messages. Many of us didn't know where our friends and family were. We had a steady stream of army personnel, volunteers, media and donations coming through. So this became a place where people could come when they needed support, when they needed information, answers, some safety. It was busy, it was stressful, and it was emotional. So what we all know about stress and emotion in ordinary days, let alone days when we have a bushfire around us and we're threatened, is that it often makes it very hard for us to pretend. So we're stripped away of all capacity we have to pretend that things are okay. So for those of us who are here providing support on a daily basis for people who are coming through, and this was a 24-hour relief centre, we were confronted with many people who were experiencing fear and trauma well beyond any threat that the bushfire was posing. So from the elderly man who was incredibly malnourished and fearful of his adult child carer, to the teenage boy who physically stood over his siblings and mother and demanded their cash, to the wives who were verbally abused and then abandoned by their partners because they wanted to stay and protect their pets, we were confronted with sadness and fear that many people in our community live with every single day. In truth though, in those frantic moments, it felt incredibly big and hard to tackle. Were we just overreacting? Were we crossing the line and interfering in someone else's relationship? Would we just make it worse? The answer is that yes, this is really big and it's really hard. It's sad and it's complex. But this is our community, our responsibility, and the reality is that we have a very big issue. According to the latest Crime Statistics Agency data, the family violence incident rate per 100,000 people in the Ovens-Murray region is 1,729, compared to the statewide average of 1,396. This makes us the 7th highest family violence incident rate among the 17 areas in Victoria. This means that for every 100 people in the Ovens-Murray region, there's over 1.7 family violence incidents, and that's just the ones we know about. Family violence, also known as domestic violence or domestic abuse, is any abusive behaviour that is used to control someone in a family or an intimate relationship, and that makes that person afraid, either for their own safety or the safety of someone else. We know that family violence very rarely happens as a single incident. Rather, it's usually a pattern of ongoing behaviour that can include multiple tactics to intimidate, control and abuse someone. The frequency and severity of family violence can change over time and can impact other members of the family or household, especially children. It's important to remember that family violence isn't just about physical harm. Emotional, financial, social and spiritual abuse all undermine a victim survivor's self-worth, their confidence and their independence, and they help the perpetrator maintain control and power. Sexual and physical abuse is any actual or threatened non-consensual sexual contact or physical attack. Behaviours can be physically abusive, even if they don't result in visible or lasting injuries and damage. Coercive control tactics instill fear in victim survivors, wear down their sense of identity and independence, and entrap them in a violent relationship by closing off options for accessing safety and support. Coercive control is incredibly complex. It includes behaviours that victim survivors considered abusive but can be very hard for other people to identify. Things like body language, the click of a pen, a look, or a deliberately chosen word can instill fear and dread when it's part of a pattern of controlling behaviour. This makes it very hard to consider as evidence or prosecute within the criminal justice system. With the introduction of the Orange Door in Ovens Murray in August 2021, our community and partner agencies are providing a collaborative and integrated intake and assessment service to ensure that adults and children have access to appropriate support services in our community. There are many, many incredible people working in this sector to help people and families who experience violence, and many of those people are here tonight. If you'd like to connect with anyone in our CAB or Orange Door team, we have staff members who will be in the foyer after tonight's discussion. Our partners of Women's Health Goulburn North East, VACA, Gateway, Headspace and Junction Services are also in the lobby. One of the things that our community does best is care for each other. So it's exciting to see both the Big Brother, Big Sister and the Grit and Resilience program here as well tonight. I look back on that period of having the Relief Centre running here at the PAC and think how we had no idea that the bushfires were actually just the start of what would be a deeply stressful, challenging and isolating period of our history. I often think about those people who we met. I wonder what the last years have been like for them. I hope that they have been okay, that they have had people and services around them to help. I would like to finish by acknowledging all victim survivors of sexual harassment, assault and abuse, family violence and relational violence. On behalf of CAV, our board and our partner agencies, we acknowledge their resilience, strength and determination to not be defined by their experiences. We would also all like to acknowledge those who have lost their lives through sexual assault and family violence. Thank you.
Jamie. How amazing to have such a local conversation, to have the Centre Against Violence here now with such great leadership and services like Orange Door opening. The on-the-ground support is growing and we've still got a long way to go, and I hope that tonight's community conversation empowers people in the community to access services, to speak up, to call out when they see early signs. Now, I get the pleasure of introducing our panel before we open to some questions. So I will start at this end. Now, I know that everybody has the bio in your program, so I'm not going to read that out. These are three women that I've known for many years, all of whom have inspired me. So although I was thrilled when I was contacted by Georgia about participating tonight, when she told me who the lineup was, I started getting a little fangirly. So I'm going to ask each one of these women to just give a little minute of introduction of themselves, if we may. And it looks like I'm going to start down at Celeste. So we have Celeste Little. Celeste, tell us something about you that's not in your bio.
What's in the bio? Look, before I say anything, I just too wanted to acknowledge the Bangarang people and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and identify myself. Saritna, Jenna Celeste Little Parula, Yanga, Parula, Mbantuenya. My name is Celeste Little and I'm an Aranda woman whose traditional lands are Alice Springs, and then east and southeast of there is essentially what I've just said. I'm trying to remember what's in the bio, but I don't know.
That is not all in the bio, and that's a beautiful personal introduction, so thank you for sharing.
Yeah, and you know, as a traditional owner somewhere else, I do acknowledge that the Bangarang have never ceded their sovereignty, that a treaty or sovereign agreement is yet to be negotiated for the use of these lands. So as a visitor, traditional owner from elsewhere, I pledge my solidarity in the ongoing struggle for justice here. I don't know. I spend an awful lot of time going to punk gigs, so I've just appropriately, I apologise.
Awesome. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Thank you. I'm going to work up in a sort of rational way. Carly Finlay in the middle there. And I should have made sure that you'd seen your bios. You all shine in the bios.
Hello. I also would like to pay my respects to the Bangarang people, and as an artist, as a writer, I'm forever thankful to Aboriginal people who have been telling stories on this land since the beginning of time. I haven't read my bio either. Who does? Something that's probably not on my bio, but we all do it. We are roller skaters. I'm not very good. These ladies are probably better than me.
Yeah, no, I haven't put mine on ever since I sprained my ankle.
I haven't been on my skates for a little while, but I did sustain my first skating injury the other day. I was pretty proud of that. Haven't broken anything yet, which is good.
Beautiful. So I'm now picturing roller skating at a punk gig. Clementine Ford, could you tell us something about you that I can add to my imagery?
Hello, everyone. Also, I am a visitor here. Obviously, my context is I am a white woman, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Bungarong people, to thank them for having me here, and also to acknowledge as Celeste that sovereignty of these lands has never been ceded. So we all have to be active in that collective solidarity, in that collective fight. And I'd like to thank people like Celeste in particular for being so much at the forefront of, I'm going to say educating, but there's so many problems with that notion of it being the role of an already oppressed people to do education that should have happened a long time ago. So I hope that makes sense in saying that. Something that is not... I also wanted to say as well, I think it was someone mentioned it at the start of the proceedings, that I wanted to acknowledge all of the survivors in the room as well. And I know that sitting through things like this can be incredibly distressing and also presumably extremely frustrating, because the pace at which we are moving as a society in making change when it comes to protecting women and children in particular is seemingly glacial. So I would also like to acknowledge you and your ongoing fight to change the world. Something that's not in my bio. I hate my bio. It's so awkward to listen to. I actually do think I know what's in it, and it's just, every time I hear it, I think, what a twat. Something that's not in my bio is I just moved house this week, and I was quite astonished by all of the things that one manages to collect in a 3-year period, particularly going through multiple lockdowns. And it was an incredibly emotional experience. So I guess there's that as well that bonds every single person who lives in this state in particular, is the kind of collective experience of multiple lockdowns, of pandemic living. And I don't really think that we're all on the other side of that. I mean, we're certainly not on the other side of the pandemic, but we haven't even begun to wrestle with what that has meant for us personally, emotionally, and also collectively. And one of my favourite podcasts is called You Are Good, and one of the hosts of it said it's a movie podcast, and he was talking about Dazed and Confused, which is, of course, is a nostalgia film. But you can only make nostalgia films to at least 2 decades after the fact. And he said that, you know, you live through a time, and enough time has to go past before you understand what happened in that time. And it's going to be a long time until we can really, truly reckon with what has happened in the last 3 years. That doesn't really tell you anything about me, but it does tell you the things that I'm interested in thinking about, I guess.
Well, please tell me that you packed a pair of roller skates or some merch for a punk gig. Just link it in for me. You don't have roller skates?
I wish I'd known that we were going to have a skate later. I would have brought my skates.
I just wore mine, like, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I moved house recently and mine are still in the packing stages.
We're going to get them out. Thank you so much. I love it when people are willing to share something that's, you know, not written about them and not available to everybody through
It's a really nice way to ask people to do a bio. I've never had it before, but I'd like for everyone to adopt it.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Now, we have, throughout the process of promoting and selling tickets, we've asked the community, because this is a community conversation, to provide some questions for the panellists. So we have some of those with us tonight. For efficiency, I'm going to read the questions, but I'm going to ask the person who, and I hope they'll be here, the person who posed it to stand and let themselves be known, so that other people in the networking event afterwards can have a conversation with you if it's something that resonates with them, and so that we know where these questions have come from within our community. And I guess as being the CEO of the Centre Against Violence, you probably get, to put a question in there somewhere. So we might get Jamie to ask her question first.
Thank you. And I will say that this is actually a question from quite a few of us organisations who talk about this quite regularly. So our question is, why does it often seem to be feminist-based organisations, predominantly staffed by women, who are responsible for preventing men from being violent?
I'm going to defer to either again.
I think it comes out of the collective need, to be honest. So the reason why it often ends up being women-based organisations or women organising collectively is because within society the dominant power structure is masculine, white and colonial, and so it takes a bunch of women getting together, sharing collective experiences, and then deciding that they want to do something about it, to start pushing back. And unfortunately, you don't really get that as individuals. It needs to be collectives pulling together and creating the organisations that, sorry, I'm just making this a little bit more comfy, creating the organisations to give other women some of their power back in order to change their lives or push back.
Also, it's care work. Essentially, it's community care work, and care work, which is often thankless and unpaid or very lowly paid, is expected to be done by women. I don't think that the way that patriarchy socialises men, particularly white, heterosexual, colonialist patriarchy, it doesn't socialise men to be part of collectives. It socialises them to be part of fraternities, part of a brotherhood that supports and upholds the dominant power systems and gives them some kind of illusion of power within that, because they have a group of people below them whom they can perceive to be more powerful than, as a sort of reward for their complicity in the system. But they're not actually taught how to operate collectively with each other or with community need in mind, which is, I think, why also why a lot of men with genuine intentions or not respond to questions about domestic abuse and community change with always diverting to, well, what about us? What about the experiences that we have? When are you going to do something to help men? I mean, I know that we've all had this same experience of being asked by countless men, I couldn't even count them at this point in my career, who've responded to really serious issues that you've raised about quantifiable, evidence-based harm that is experienced by different marginalised groups with, well, when are you going to fix my problems? And I mean, there's two issues with that. And the first, of course, is, well, what are you doing to fix your problems? Why aren't you out there leading some community charge with other men to try and collectively heal yourselves and solve this situation for yourself? Why are you expecting women to do it for you? And also, why, obviously, I mean, the not all men thing is so distracting, but why and how are we still at this point where a seemingly rational person who wants you to believe that he is a rational person and who also wants you to care about him enough to change his life for the better cannot even humanise women and marginalised groups enough to go, fuck, it's really bad that so many men are killing women, isn't it? Let's do something about that. And then maybe after that, we can solve the problem of my depression.
Sorry to bring in a personal situation here, but one of the reasons I just moved house was because I had two violent neighbours. And it started off with one violent neighbour. And I went to the police, and I also went to the magistrate's court, and I have a personal safety order out against that neighbour. And over the Christmas break, another neighbour in the apartment block that I lived in, colluded with the first violent neighbour. And I have seen you know, throughout my career, throughout living, so many men siding with violent men, but it didn't happen to me until then. And to have not only that one neighbour colluding, but the other neighbour's flatmate colluding as well, and I was told, oh, you know, don't take this any further, you'll regret it, or, you know, he's just young, he's got a lot of trauma, you're the older woman here, and you'll make him look bad. And then I became terrified. Like, I didn't even want to hang out the washing, you know, in the day. I work from home now most days, and I didn't want to go outside because I've got these two really awful neighbours that I'm scared of. So I ended up moving, and I said to my landlord, who is a man, I said, you know, I'm sick of violent men defending violent men. And he said, well, I'm not one of those. And I said, but you haven't even watched the video of evidence that I showed you. And so we moved house, and it's cost a lot. And while there's a court order out, it wasn't enough to get an admission to the police. So, you know, yeah, I think that when women raise the issue of violence, so many men defend other men, and that has to stop.
So we're hearing about how the impact of violence and gendered violence spills over into the community, even between households. And I think one of the key messages for tonight, in it being a community conversation, is that this is something that all of us need to really take on as a front of mind challenge in our communities. And we talked, I heard about collaborating, there being a collective need, and perhaps that's why these organisations have sprung up. And certainly, you know, the organisation that I worked started grassroots, and it was some good people putting their own time into it. Does seem like men can collaborate when they need to close ranks and talk about how they've done nothing wrong, or how you might have been a protagonist, or how you should excuse the behaviour. So the ways in which we collaborate, maybe men and women collaborate for different reasons. Maybe men who are invested in the patriarchy collaborate to continue that because, and this is something I've been saying in my workplace lately, is, you know, why would they change it? It's working really well for them.
But that is true, absolutely. But the other thing as well is that patriarchy really doesn't work well for a lot of men.
No.
And the conditioning of society that is many thousands of years old, obviously, can't be changed. I mean, it always baffled me how people would make the argument that, oh, why are you a feminist? You know, everything's equal now. As if, like, somehow in the last 70 years we've managed to overturn. I mean, firstly, obviously that's nonsense. But as if somehow humanity, which holds on to, like, its waning power structures so fiercely, had somehow summoned the collective will in the last 70 years to change all of human history. I think that what it is that men are, you know, Bell Hooks wrote that the first act that patriarchy demands of men, the first violent act that patriarchy demands of men, is not violence towards other women, but not violence towards other people, but violence towards themselves. And that violent act is basically the excising of their emotional selves in order to become a husk or a robot in service of the patriarchy. And one of the things that is the consequence of that, and is part of the conditioning, and is why men are so easily able to collaborate with each other in exactly the same way that white people are so easily able to collaborate with each other, and that we carry it in us if we exist in the dominant power structure. We carry it with us, and we have to be aware of it rather than making excuses. Well, I would never do that, because what you can't ever account for. You know, Peggy, oh my God, I'm so sorry, her last name has slipped my mind. The Invisible Knapsack. Peggy McIntosh wrote about the invisible knapsack, which is the invisible knapsack of tools that all white people carry through society, which basically they can reach into at any point to exert their white supremacy. And I remember thinking when Christine Cooper, the Central Park woman, had, you know, called the police on Chris Cooper, I think his name was, you know, in a racist and a racially motivated attack against him, because she had been shamed or she had been embarrassed. She'd experienced some kind of she was doing the wrong thing and he called her out for it. And so immediately she just reached right into that backpack and she took out the tools that she knew she had in society as a white woman. And I remember thinking at the time that all of these other people who I saw saying things like, oh, I would never do that, and white women especially saying, I would never do that, I would never do that, she's a bad person, I would never do that. And because of the kind of, because of that need for us to constantly be self-educating and to be reading the works of, in this instance, writers and activists of colour, I felt like I suddenly had an understanding of how dangerous that was, because we can't know until we're in a situation like that how our white supremacy will rear its head. So we have to always walk through the world, if you're a white person, knowing that at any point in time you can express your white supremacy, and it is foolhardy to suggest that somehow you are better than that, because we all benefit from it if we're white. And the only, or the easiest way, or the best way, the most instructive way to try to not reach into that backpack is to be aware that you always carry it. And I think that men who respond to things about domestic abuse and about men's violence against women with, well, I'm not that. They're not willing to accept that, yes, you are part of that structure and you benefit from, all men benefit from men's violence against women, whether or not they're directly exerting it, they are beneficiaries of it. And until they reckon with that and admit that and accept that, they can't ever really fully be part of the change, because they will never be willing to step outside of patriarchy and step outside of collaborating with other men in order to challenge the system that benefits men.
Beautiful. I have a question here that leads really well into. So we have Joseph from Gateway Health. Joseph, hello there. Thank you so much for contributing a question. And so this was around, how do we bring men into the discussion? When most men would say they're not perpetrators, the hashtag not all men, what would be your message to these men and young men? Thanks, Joseph. Great question.
No, it is a great question, and I think the first part we need to understand is that violence against women, or family violence, or violence in general that's perpetrated by men doesn't just exist by itself. It's part of a continuum. It's part of an ongoing power structure within society that needs to be undone. And it starts with that conditioning from a young age of trying to remove emotions from boys, talking about how they're being showing weakness and showing femininity, like calling young boys girls if they step out of line, as if being a girl is the worst thing in the world that they could be, and then that continues, and it has so many manifestations. Some of the best work that I've seen on this, and I don't think that this is going to come as any surprise, but it's come from men who are doubly marginalised. So I think of the work that has been done by the Tarngeri Men's Healing organisation, which works alongside the sister organisation, the Tarngeri Women's Family Violence and Safety Group. In order to engage young Aboriginal men in the territory, try and unpack why it is that they feel angry or voiceless or squashed or suffocated by the many forces, whether it's racism, sexism, whatever else, and try and give them a more healthy bunch of tools in order to deal with these emotions, and also teach them, start breaking down some of these hard gender roles that have mainly sort of been imposed from a young age, but are also, when it comes to Indigenous communities, greatly imported by colonisation. They've been doubly imposed upon. That and things like Bush Mob, which deals with young perpetrators in the territory and tries to, or kids at risk, and tries to engage them more positively. Like, if you're having discussions that start to unpack all of these negative things that boys are taught from a young age as they become men, and they start to engage both with themselves and with society in more positive sorts of ways, so that they see that, you know, nurturing isn't a sign of weakness, that collaboration isn't a sign of weakness, that showing pride in culture and pride in where you come from isn't a sign of weakness. Yeah, it starts to unpack some of the damage that's done. So I just think we need to understand that, you know, the violence part is at the extreme end of the scale, but it's continuously reinforced over and over again by the idea in society that that women are somehow less, that girls are somehow less, and therefore that this power needs to be exerted to ensure that they stay less, and that's what we need to undo.
In 1983, Marilyn Fry wrote in her book of essays, The Politics of Reality, that heterosexuality amongst men was inherently homoerotic, because the only thing, in fact, that men needed women for was to have sex with and to obviously care for them. But that everything that men valued and everything that men looked to admire and from whom they sought to be led by, from whom they sought to teach, were other men. And I think that I remember when I first read that thinking that was written 40 years ago, and it still feels like it could have been written today. It's still so insightful, because I think the one thing I would add to Celeste's excellent comment is that men also need to be, and boys need to be instructed on how to be led by women and how to defer to women's leadership without feeling like it threatens their masculinity in some way, or it threatens their manhood. Something that I often say to women, because a lot of my kind of, I guess, work now is done directly speaking to women in a sort of social media capacity. And I hear from lots of women who are dealing with, as Celeste pointed out, the spectrum of violence. And some of these behaviours would never be characterised in a broader society that doesn't understand these dynamics as being abusive. Because when you say a behaviour is abusive, people automatically get their backs up and they think that you're saying that the man should be thrown in jail because he's a wife beater, or whatever colloquial language people want to use. But it's things like, you know, leaving the entirety of the childcare to a woman in a house and not giving her any support or sleep or respect. That's an abusive behaviour. And I think a lot of people don't realise that they're actually existing in abusive scenarios, because that's how heterosexuality and heteronormativity has been established and framed as well. So one thing I often say to women is that, you know, men need to have a curiosity about women's lives, because curiosity about things is and curiosity about people is one of the quickest paths to humanising people. If you have curiosity about their life, then you're already seeing them as a human, and it's much harder, although not impossible obviously, but it's much harder to express ongoing systemic and personal violence against people who you do deeply consider to be human. Yeah.
Beautiful. Carly, did you want to?
I think adding to what Celeste said, from a disability perspective, I've seen behaviours from some, not all, disabled men that has been really violent, and lots of derogatory statements towards women, about women, and gender diverse people. And I do wonder whether the behaviour stems from the need for disabled men to prove their masculinity, to prove they're, you know, less disabled than they are. Because so much of the time disabled people are infantilised, and we are seen as lesser, we are seen as children, you know, non-sexual beings. And so perhaps that's where the behaviour has come from. And I, as a disabled woman, have definitely experienced, you know, some form of violence from some disabled men. And I don't know whether there is the level of accountability for those men as there is for non-disabled men as well. And I don't know whether there's other non-disabled men pulling them up, or sorry, disabled men pulling them up, but as Celeste said, you know, in those groups and in those community programs, I don't think disability's there yet.
What I'm hearing here is a strong call to action and a deep compassion about where does this come from, and it starts young and it is all around us, and that spectrum, the thin edge is things that people don't identify as a problem until you sort of follow that compass setting and you realise you end up in exactly the wrong place when you get down to the other end of the spectrum. And I think it's great that we are talking in general terms when we're talking about the difference amongst genders. And I think that is not the only intersection, and there's a great question which has actually come from Georgia O'Connor, and I just have to mention that Georgia is also the project manager of tonight, and she has handled herself in late pregnancy with exhaustion and nausea all the way to the lectern. So Georgia, could you stand up for us? Oh, there she is at the back there. So this is a question from Georgia.
She's also walked up all those stairs too.
Yeah. And so Georgia is with the Rural City of Wangaratta, and her question was that we know that women and families are not equally affected by family violence. For example, women living with disabilities, First Nations women and the LGBTI+ community experience higher risks of family violence. So what sorts of things can we do as a community to prevent violence against groups at higher risks?
I've come with a heap of notes. Last week or the week before, the Victorian State Disability Plan was launched, and it is a very good plan. I highly recommend you go and search for it. The plan says that disabled people are almost 3 times more likely to experience family violence. We are more than twice as likely to experience sexual violence, and we're also 15% less likely to feel that we have a say within the general community on important issues like these. I wanted to mention that violence to disabled people often happens by support workers or carers, so it could be family members. And I wanted to raise the topic of Anne-Marie Smith. What I'm about to talk about is quite sensitive, so if you need to step out for a moment, please do. Anne-Marie Smith was a disabled woman in South Australia, and she was in her 50s. She had cerebral palsy, and in 2020 she was found neglected in her home. Her support worker, Rosa Malone, left her in a cane chair. That's where she sat, that's where she slept, that's where she used the toilet. She was severely malnourished and she had lots of wounds to her body, and she died. And last week Rosa was sentenced to 6 years jail for manslaughter. 6. And this, Anne-Marie was just one disabled person. This happens to so many people, and the disability community has condemned the 6 years that Rosa has been sentenced to. I don't believe that the NDIA, the National Disability Insurance Agency, through which Anne-Marie was receiving support through, has been fined either. I don't think there's any kind of ramification to them. But again, the very person that was paid to take care of her neglected and killed her. And this stuff happens to so many disabled people, so many who aren't able to speak out about it because they're scared. I mean, there are many disabled people who can't leave abusive relationships because the very abusers are their support workers or carers. And so I think we have to really remember this. And I'm just one disabled person, so it is really important that you hear from a range of people. Women with Disabilities Victoria is a really good start on this. They've done some really great work. Safe Steps has also launched a disability support program, and the E-Safety Commissioner actually has provided a range of resources on digital tracking, like some of the coercive control things that might happen. They've provided a range of resources, but definitely seek out the work of both Women with Disabilities Victoria and Women with Disabilities Australia, who've done some very important work on that. And you can hear from women and gender diverse people who have experienced violence firsthand and work to change that.
Oh, geez, I've got, like, if we're talking intersectionality, I kind of have so much to say. So firstly, look, I just wanted to actually acknowledge the courage of Jayara Atkinson getting up here as a Bangarang woman. My throat today is not great, people, I'm really sorry. And stating that she is a domestic violence survivor. I am an Arundel woman. I am also a domestic violence survivor. I left a domestic violence situation about 15 years ago nearly, and a survivor of other types of, other types of violence that have been perpetrated on me. And we know that the statistics for Aboriginal women is significantly higher. Like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are about 34% more likely to be victims of domestic and family violence. They're 70% more likely to present to hospital with a brain injury as a result of domestic and family violence. We're 3 to 5% more likely to be victims of sexual violence. These are stats that we hear over and over again, but the problem is that when we hear these stats, the sorts of ways that people talk about often, solving them, actually often equate to enacting state violence on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Like, one example, I keep going back to the Territory. I'm sorry, I come from red dust and big caterpillars. That's my mob. But I had a lot of people, a lot of family members who are living under the Northern Territory intervention that, to various degrees, still exist to this day. And one of the biggest arguments behind that was that Aboriginal women were suffering from extreme amounts of violence, and therefore we needed army and police rolling into those communities, shutting down any self-determined programs that we had running and enforcing power on it in order to stop it from happening. And the statistics that came back following the intervention actually showed that rates of domestic and family violence actually increased following the intervention. They didn't decrease. A lot of the reason for that is precisely what I said. Any sort of self-determined programs that Aboriginal women, community groups, youth groups, anything like that, our self-determined family violence centres that we have across this country, in the Territory at that point ended up being defunded. You lot can't take care of your own affairs, you're not speaking out about it, you need to be managed. And therefore, through other stresses like state violence, like financial stress and all of that, these things started escalating. And I think that that's the problem, over and over again. Like, they continually talked about Aboriginal women who were victims of violence in the Territory, but they didn't ever actually talk, put any Aboriginal women who were doing that work in front of a camera to talk about what the solutions were. We were invisible, continuously removed from the conversation. I'll never forget this issue of invisibility, and we see this replicated actually with Indigenous women across the world. A lot of people have seen the the campaign that they got running over in Canada about the missing Indigenous women there, and a lot of people were putting a special Facebook filter on to show solidarity with the missing and murdered First Nations women in Canada. But we've got a very similar sort of issue here. There was a point where for 2 years I sat there and we had Destroy the Joint, and we had Real for Women and the Red Heart Society?
I think it's the Red Heart Campaign.
Red Heart Campaign, all counting deaths of women as a result of violence. And none of them were necessarily, except the Red Heart Campaign, were necessarily pointing out where Aboriginal women were. So for 2 years I sat there and I trawled through these lists. And I found the Aboriginal women in these lists. And what I found was that for a group of women that only make up 3% of the population, we were representing in those lists between 16 to 21%, which is, 6 to 7 times what our population parity rates would be. But not just that. In a lot of the times that this would happen, there'd be no names, there'd be one police report and then no follow-up, so there was no media interest. There were times when it took me 2 years to find an Aboriginal woman's name who'd been killed, and people would come back to me going, oh, I thought it was culturally insensitive to name Aboriginal people once they're dead, and I'm just sort of, that's not why they're not naming these women. Like, we have cultural protocols, you hear Kumanjai or, Mr. or Doctor or, titles used with surnames or whatever else, or cultural things like Kumanjai, which means person going to the spirit world. We've got alternatives. People can be named, people can be talked about, and people can be respected, but they weren't being. There was one police report and then there was no media follow-up. And the only time that I ever saw any media follow-up that was really, really huge was in the case of Yvette Rigney. And the only reason why that went on for weeks was because she was a woman who, her children were also killed by her partner, but she was a recovering drug user who was on the pension. And so the media continuously focused on how messy her house was and how she was on government files for receiving a pension, as if it was a messy house or it was a former drug use that had killed those kids and not a man who had decided that he was going to murder. So yeah, I just come to the conclusion that when it comes to the intersectionality rungs, Aboriginal women continue to sit on the lowest rungs, and there is no respect for any, no respect for our lives, but also no respect for the self-determined programs that we try and get up off the ground over and over again. I don't want to hear continuously that JIRA or the Alice Springs Women's Shelter or Tungunjeri Women's Safety Group and all that have to continuously fight for funds just to keep women safe. It's ridiculous. They shouldn't be. They need to, funding is crucial. We need to be supporting these organisations that reach out to these communities.
And I think a lot of, as Celeste said, many disabled people who are killed in violent situations, in domestic violence situations, are not named either. And when there are cases of filicide, so when a mother or father kills their disabled child, it's often excused. It's excused because we are seen as disabled people to be hard work and to be burdens. And so, that there's been a number of quite high-profile cases in the last few years where parents have killed their disabled children and it's been excused as respite. And the other thing is, I think in other countries, disability is seen as such a taboo that we're not even acknowledged. So in 2016, there was a mass murder that took place in a care home in Sagamihara in Japan. And again, a support worker killed 19 disabled people, and they were intellectually disabled, and those people haven't been named because I guess disability is shameful in that culture, and we don't know who they are, and we'll never know who they were and what they enjoyed. And there was a beautiful little video made a few years ago, probably on the first anniversary of that killing, called 19 Paper Cranes, and it was made in conjunction with the disability organisation, and it talked about the joy that intellectually disabled people in Japan have brought. But we don't know their names, and I think that's the case for so many marginalised people who are killed or injured by violence. It's because of the shame.
Thank you for sharing from such a personally involved perspective. I'm feeling that's really quite heavy. And I'm feeling so privileged that although none of us speak for all of whom we represent, that we have amazing people here who can share from a really lived experience and a very well-informed experience that we would not have had the opportunity if not for your willingness and courage to participate. Both of you have said things that make me think about how our journey with shame over the last 20 years has been a progressive one, and I think that by sharing our stories of being victim survivors, of saying that's not my shame, that's their shame, and of calling out shame, that we can actually shine the light onto shame. And shame doesn't like light, it likes dark closets where it can continue to thrive. So I really personally really appreciate the share there. I'm going to bring another bottle of water over.
Oh, I don't need any more water. Yeah. Quite full up with water.
I just realised that one finished.
Is there any opportunity to ask a question?
Sorry, yes, we've got questions from the community that we've taken along the way. And I must say, Celeste, I was just going to give you a nod of when we talked in the green room about how long these things take to unpack. And so we've got 7 questions from the community, and we're actually almost out of time. So I'm going to go to one that was provided by 2 people. So this has a double layer over. Belinda Gadsby and Lisa Cambaray Peruzzo, both from VACA. If you're here, could you stand up or give us a wave so that we know where this is coming from? Thank you for the work that you do. So this question is, and I think this is a lovely one for us to wrap up on, because it is, how do we, as a community, support and encourage family violence perpetrators to access services so that we can change the cycle of violence? Because that's what this conversation is about. How do we start to interfere on that cycle? How do we call people in to address the behaviours that are going on? So, how, in your last summing up, what sorts of, oh, sorry, I've lost myself. Oh, I've just repeated the question, my apologies. No, that's good. How do we support and encourage family violence perpetrators to access services so that we can change the cycle of violence?
I said before that it's often thought of as that disabled men are, you know, not as masculine as they are. And I think that to access the services need to be accessible for disabled people. And so we need to ensure that those services are, you know, wheelchair accessible, that they are in easy English, that they've got Auslan provisions, that they're in places that are accessible for disabled people, because I think that maybe that is a reason why people can't access them, because they're literally inaccessible to members of our community.
I think that there's structural things that can be addressed that I'm certainly not an expert in, so I won't attempt to even suggest what they may be. And I know that based on one of your answers from earlier, Celeste, as well, you've got a lot of programs already that you know about that would ideally fit the bill in terms of modelling. I guess what I want to add is that it feels to me again like we're coming back to that point, and maybe I'm being too idealistic, and maybe I'm being too cynical. Either way, you could look at it from two perspectives. But we're coming back to the first question almost of like, well, why is it women's organisations that are expected to lead this change? And when I hear that question, what can we do to make services more, leaving aside the fact that of course they need to be accessible and of course they need to work, they can't be punitive, they have to be restorative. It also just feels to me like, once again, we're thinking, well, what can we as women largely, who care about this issue and who want to protect other women and children, and who also, despite what the sort of dominant social narrative and men's rights activists in particular would like to believe, also are deeply invested in the humanity of men. Like these services don't exist because we hate men and we want men to suffer. I don't, as a mother of a son, I sort of hate that kind of like, well, as a mother, but the fact is I am raising a boy, so I have to think about these questions from a really personal perspective as well. I don't take any pleasure or joy, Twitter jokes aside, in the suffering of men. I don't take any pleasure in knowing that men have, men are 3 times more likely to end their life by suicide, although women are 3 times more likely to try to end their life by suicide. That speaks to a deep pain that is being experienced and suffered by men because of patriarchy. Men don't suffer that pain because women have success in the workplace. Mm-hmm. They don't suffer that pain because women are at home asking them to help with the laundry. Like, that pain exists because patriarchy has, as I said earlier, quoting Bell Hooks, has instructed boys from childhood to excise the parts of themselves that would be here otherwise, and having this conversation willingly and wanting to find their humanity and wanting to treat other people with humanity and respect. So I feel like the structural things are all one thing that we can think about, but we also have to think much more broadly about what can we do in society, how can we keep chipping away in our own collective little corner. And Donna, you mentioned Ada Conroy before, who's a great friend of mine, and she's just such an incredible worker in this space. And I know she didn't come up with this quote, but she's the one who taught it to me, and that's that we have to accept that we're planting seeds for a forest we may never get to sit in. One of the great kind of griefs, I guess, about working in any kind of environment or field where you're trying to enact social and cultural change, particularly, for the express end game of making sure that people aren't killed in acts of violence, is that it does move so slowly. And I think that part of being in this job is that we have to sort of make our peace with the fact that we may not live to see the full realisation of it, but we keep waking up and trying every day. And we might do that in our own little corners, like with the children that we raise or the men that we work with, but we can't do it without men also being on board. We can't do it without men being part of that change, and without men wanting to learn from other men who are leading that change and who are unpacking their own learned and instructed masculinity that is used as a weapon against other people, but certainly against themselves as well.
Again, I've got so many things in my head that I don't know where to start. How many minutes have we got?
We've got about another 2 minutes.
2, okay. Oh boy. I'm probably going to then just try and truncate it by going back to structural. So what I will say is that what I often hear in response to violence against women is talk about go to the police, go and report it to the police. I can't tell you how many of the women that ended up dead, black, white or brindle, who had existing, ABOs, those sorts of orders on their perpetrators. Hannah Clark had an order against her killer and the killer of her children. There's so many orders that a lot of these Aboriginal women that I've mentioned, have used as well. I think that what we can do structurally is actually ensure that we have an amazing, robust social safety net, like where, one of the things that we've fought a lot for, I work in the union movement, so we've fought a lot for things like domestic violence leave, because women who have some sort of financial independence have the means to then go and set themselves up in a different situation. So they're more likely to be able to escape violence because they're not sitting in a situation where they are forced to be financially dependent on someone. So the ability to be able to continue work as people are leaving domestic violence situations, and to be supported to continue work, even if they need time off to go and, have a court appearance, go to the cops, whatever else, is crucial. Funding services that are women-driven, that are culturally appropriate, and that create opportunities, such as, we talk a lot about, I think we need significantly more public housing in society, but I also think that side by side with that, we need social housing. I'll never forget the day that I read that an Aboriginal woman who went to the police in order to get assistance when she was leaving a domestic violence situation was actually locked up in a prison cell with her kids because the cops decided there was nowhere else to put her. How traumatising is that for the kids? How traumatising is that for that woman? Why on earth don't we have social housing in order to put a woman who is escaping a violent situation so that she is safe, so that she's got, a place to actually reset her life and then move on, and why don't we have these sorts of safety nets? There's so many times I wish that they would ask the experts a lot more about what we need, and the experts are the people who've gone through it, the people who work on the front lines with it, because they would say basic things like, we need proper funding to run these services, we need the backup support services like housing, like pensions of various descriptions, like clothing allowances, whatever else. We need these things in order to make it thrive. And the fact that most of them are running on the smell of an oily rag, I think, is an indictment against society. It kind of shows that we don't actually want things to change.
Can I just add to that quickly as well, that we also know that men who work in the police force are significantly more likely to be perpetrators of domestic abuse. And that
Google 40% of cops is...
Yeah, and we also know we've got evidence of this particularly happening in Queensland, where Hannah Clark and her children were murdered, of cops colluding with known perpetrators to provide the home addresses of women who are escaping them. In the Hannah Clark's situation, the superintendent at the inquiry said, oh, well, there was nothing we could do. He had abducted the daughter, the weeks prior to murdering Hannah and her children, but we couldn't do anything about it. So people say go to the cops, and apart from the fact that, as Celeste and also as Carly would know, marginalised groups are not safe with police, and they may be perpetrators and they may be colluding with perpetrators. They also just don't care. There's a Canadian study that showed that there are 39 indicators that basically they assessed, men who had murdered women in Canada, and they came up with a list of 39 indicators. Now they're pretty, I'm not going to read them out. You can imagine that none of them are like secret. They're fairly obvious indicators of, on a spectrum of control and violence and abuse. And of the men that they were studied in Canada, the average man showed at least 7 of these indicators. The man who murdered Hannah Clark and her children had 29 indicators on a list of 39. And he was still able to do that to 4 people. So I get to the point, and I know that you both feel similarly, of being so frustrated when people are frustrated, which is not a reflection on the question, but when society in general is like, well, what can we do? It's like, if all of the information is provided by researchers and provided by sector workers. As Celeste says, the system, and as everyone here knows, the system is chronically underfunded. No one gives a shit. The answer is always, well, they should just go to the cops. Well, okay, well, the cops could kill them or could provide no help or assistance at all. So what do you do? I don't know. What do you do? I don't know. And that is the scariest thing, is that I don't know actually how we can change it.
And that is the question that we take away with us. You started there, Clem, with you don't know if you're too idealistic or too cynical. And we ran that track in the response there.
Very confusing.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. It's hugely complex. And I'm always so disappointed in these opportunities, conferences, speeches from people, panels, because we just start to unpick the first layer, and I think we need a week in this room rather than an hour in this room. But I have gone over time already, and that's the one responsibility that I'm meant to have. So I just wanted to reflect that we've started the conversation, and the theme is a community conversation. So the people in this room who are already working in the area, I hope that this has been, you know, a little bit of a top up to your reservoir of why you do it, and that you feel that sense of collegiateness here, that you're not alone, and that you know, that progress is being made, and that people are with you, and that you know how to bang your head on the brick wall where the crack is. And so at least that you've got a place where you can go. Some of the resources that you've provided for us tonight have been next steps for us to go and get ourselves further educated and further empowered. The postcard that Debra Parkinson spoke about has very clear steps about what we can do in the community, about seeing what goes on and knowing how to respond to it. So as a community, we can go out from here more empowered, definitely still frustrated.
And please talk to your sons about porn. It is porn.
And your daughters.
Like, the violence in porn is rotting children's brains.
Yep. Yeah. So could everybody give a warm round of applause to our panellists? Note that, you know, we're just about out of time. We are 5 minutes over time, and I apologise, please forgive me.
That was my fault.
No.
It was the topic's fault, and it's a gnarly one. I want to thank everyone who's contributed to bring this important discussion to the Rural City of Wangaratta community. I'd particularly like to thank Jamie Chubb and the wonderful team at the Centre Against Violence, as well as our speakers, Clementine Ford, Carly Finlay and Celeste Little. Dr Debra Parkinson and Jai Atkinson. And I do want to mention that tonight's discussion is just the beginning of the conversation within the Rural City of Wangaratta community. Over the coming months, the City of Wangaratta will also be working with Women's Health Goulburn North East to deliver bystander training to our rural and sporting communities, as well as working with the Mandala Project to deliver gender programs to young people in our community and their carers. So we now invite you to join us in the foyer for some of the networking, some of the questions that we didn't get to, some refreshments, to meet some of the people in the community who do serve the community around the support services here, and to continue the conversation. I think that is about it. I just want to say that the City of Wangaratta community, who are working tirelessly together to prevent and respond to family violence, thank you. Thank you for everyone for being here tonight. We can't do this important work without the community's involvement. Be well.